I never thought I would be the kind of person to question everything I had built in my career, but that day changed something in me that I still feel even now when I think about it. I had always been loyal, the kind of employee who stayed late without being asked, who solved problems before they reached my manager's desk, who trained new hires like they were part of my own responsibility. In a way, I had made myself indispensable, or so I believe. Looking back now, I realize that being indispensable does not always mean being valued in the way you expect. It started when I brought in a new hire. Her name was Melissa. She was talented but inexperienced. And my manager specifically asked me to train her because I was considered the most reliable person on the team. I took that seriously. I spent weeks guiding her through systems, teaching her how to handle clients, showing her shortcuts, explaining the unwritten rules that only experience teaches you. I even defended her mistakes in meetings because I believed she just needed time to grow. I wanted her to succeed because her success would reflect the strength of the team, and I took pride in building strong people around me. At the same time, I had been told something that gave me a sense of direction and motivation. My manager had hinted more than once that a promotion was coming my way. It was not officially written down, but it was clear enough in conversations, in the way I was given more responsibility, in the way I was included in higher-level discussions. I remember thinking that all my effort was finally being seen. I had been working toward that moment for years, quietly accepting heavier workloads and stepping in wherever there were gaps. So when the promotion was mentioned, even indirectly, I allowed myself to believe it was real. I worked even harder after that. I stayed later, came in earlier, and took ownership of projects that were not even assigned to me. I told myself it was temporary sacrifice for long-term recognition. I remember one specific project that nearly broke me with stress. Deadlines were tight, clients were demanding, and half the team was inexperienced, including Melissa. I ended up carrying most of the responsibility myself while still making sure she learned along the way. I told myself it was fine because leadership is about lifting others. Months passed like this. I did not complain. I did not question. I simply worked. Every now and then, I would hear small remarks from my manager that kept my hope alive. Things like "we are really counting on you," or "you are becoming a key part of this structure," or "we will talk about your future soon." Each of those sentences felt like a step closer to recognition. I held onto them more tightly than I realized at the time. Then came the day everything shifted. It was supposed to be a routine meeting. I walked into the office expecting updates on the promotion timeline. I had even prepared myself mentally for a confirmation. I remember adjusting my posture, feeling confident in a quiet way. I had earned it. That was what I believed. Instead, the announcement came quickly and casually, almost as if it was already decided long before I entered the room. Melissa had been promoted. She was now stepping into the role I had been expecting. I remember the moment clearly, even though everything after it feels slightly unreal, like I was watching it happen from a distance rather than living it. I smiled at first, because that is what you do in professional settings. You congratulate people. You stay composed. You do not let confusion show immediately. But inside, something collapsed. I remember looking at Melissa and seeing her shocked expression too, like she had not fully expected it either. That made it worse in a strange way. If she had been aggressively ambitious, maybe I could have understood it differently. But she looked just as surprised as I felt inside. After the meeting, I stayed behind. I asked my manager for clarification. I remember my voice was calm, almost too calm. I asked what had changed, because I had been led to believe the promotion was being considered for me. I will never forget the response. It was vague, carefully worded, full of corporate softness that avoided direct truth. I was told that I was too valuable in my current role, that my strengths were needed where I was, that Melissa showed fresh potential for leadership growth, that the company needed to invest in new energy. Each sentence sounded reasonable on its own. Together, they felt like something had been taken from me and repackaged as logic. I left the office that day without saying much. I remember walking slowly to my car, not because I was thinking, but because my mind felt strangely empty. That evening, I could not bring myself to tell anyone what had happened. I sat at home replaying every moment, trying to find where I had misunderstood things. I questioned myself more than I questioned the decision. Maybe I had imagined the promotion hints. Maybe I had not been as important as I thought. Maybe I had simply been useful, not valued. The next day at work felt different. People were congratulating Melissa. She was excited but also visibly overwhelmed. I smiled when I saw her, because it was not her fault. She had not asked to be put in that position over me. Still, every congratulations she received felt like a quiet reminder of what I had lost. I threw myself into work even more after that, almost instinctively. It was as if I wanted to prove that the decision had been wrong, without actually saying it out loud. I trained her even after the promotion. I answered her questions. I helped her adjust. Part of me felt responsible for her success, and another part of me felt erased by it. Weeks passed like that, slowly turning into months. Something in me started to change. I became quieter in meetings. I stopped volunteering for extra work. I still did my job well, but the emotional investment was gone. It was replaced by something colder, more careful. I started observing everything differently. I noticed how decisions were made, how recognition was distributed, how visibility mattered more than contribution. One afternoon, I was asked to help onboard another new hire. I agreed, but something inside me hesitated in a way it never had before. As I began explaining processes again, I caught myself thinking about the cycle repeating. I would train someone, support them, help them grow, and then watch as opportunities moved in directions I did not expect. That realization stayed with me. I started to understand that my mistake was not working hard. My mistake was believing that effort alone guarantees fairness. I had equated loyalty with security, and guidance with protection. I thought being the one who lifts others would naturally mean I would also be lifted. But workplaces do not always operate on emotional logic. They operate on visibility, timing, perception, and decisions that are not always communicated transparently. Eventually, I had a conversation with Melissa that surprised me. She told me she felt uncomfortable about how things had happened. She said she respected me deeply and did not understand why the promotion had bypassed me. In that moment, I realized she was not my competition. She was simply someone who had been placed into a situation she did not control. That conversation did not fix anything, but it softened something inside me. Over time, I stopped expecting fairness as a guarantee and started seeing it as something that had to be actively pursued and clearly communicated. I began asking questions earlier, setting boundaries, and making my own contributions more visible instead of assuming they would be noticed automatically. I also stopped measuring my worth through the success of people I trained. That was a hard shift, because mentoring had always been something I took pride in. But I learned that helping others grow should not come at the cost of disappearing myself. The promotion I was promised never came in the way I expected. In fact, I never received that specific role at all. But something else happened instead. I eventually left that company and moved into a new environment where my experience was immediately recognized in a different way. Ironically, leaving became the moment where I finally stepped into a position that aligned with my skills and value. Now when I think back, I do not feel anger the way I used to. I feel clarity. I understand that I was not replaced because I was not good enough. I was overlooked because I trusted assumptions instead of confirmations. I gave too much weight to informal promises and too little attention to written reality. What happened taught me something simple but important. Hard work matters, but so does recognition. Loyalty matters, but so does self-advocacy. And helping others grow is meaningful, but only if I do not disappear in the process. I still train people. I still help others succeed. But I do it differently now. I make sure my own path is visible, my contributions are documented, and my goals are spoken out loud, not just assumed. Because I learned that silence can sometimes turn effort into invisibility, and I will never let that happen to me again. After I left that company, I thought I would feel an immediate sense of relief, like a weight being lifted completely off my shoulders, but the truth was more complicated than that. At first, there was a strange emptiness, as if I had removed myself from something that had defined my daily life for so long that I did not yet know who I was without it. I would wake up in the morning still half expecting emails from the old team, still mentally preparing for meetings that no longer existed, still running through tasks that belonged to a version of me that had already moved on. The new job I took was smaller in structure but more direct in communication. From the beginning, expectations were clearly written, responsibilities were defined, and growth paths were discussed openly rather than hinted at. It felt unfamiliar at first, almost uncomfortable, because I had become used to reading between lines instead of hearing things directly. But slowly, that clarity started to heal something in me that I did not even realize had been damaged. I remember the first time my new manager gave me feedback in a straightforward way. There was no ambiguity, no hidden meaning, no soft phrasing designed to avoid discomfort. Just honest, constructive direction. At that moment, I realized how exhausted I had been from constantly interpreting vague signals in my previous workplace. I had spent so much energy trying to decode what people really meant that I had forgotten how simple communication could feel when it was not wrapped in uncertainty. Still, I carried the past with me longer than I expected. Even in the new environment, I found myself hesitating before trusting positive feedback. When someone said I was doing well, a part of me would silently wait for the contradiction, for the hidden reversal, for the moment where praise would turn into disappointment or replacement. It took time for me to understand that not every environment operates on the same unspoken rules I had experienced before. One afternoon, while working on a project, I was asked to lead a small internal presentation. Normally, in my previous job, I would have downplayed my involvement, shared credit broadly, and focused more on the team than myself. But this time, I was told explicitly that the presentation was about my work and my approach. There was no need to dilute it. That instruction alone felt like something revolutionary to me. As I stood in front of the team, I noticed my voice was steadier than I expected. I spoke clearly about the process, the decisions, the challenges, and the outcomes. I did not over-explain, and I did not minimize my role. When I finished, the feedback was immediate and positive. People asked questions, engaged with the ideas, and acknowledged the work directly. It was a simple moment, but it stayed with me longer than I thought it would. After that presentation, I walked back to my desk and realized something important. I had spent years believing that hard work naturally speaks for itself, but I was beginning to understand that sometimes it needs a voice as well. Not an exaggerated voice, not a self-promoting one, but a clear and present one that does not disappear behind assumptions. Over time, I started rebuilding my confidence in a different way. Not the kind of confidence that comes from being quietly dependable, but the kind that comes from being seen and acknowledged in real time. I began setting clearer boundaries around my responsibilities. I stopped automatically absorbing extra work that was outside my role unless it was properly recognized. I also learned to ask direct questions about growth opportunities instead of waiting for indirect signals. There were still moments when memories of the past would surface unexpectedly. I would think about Melissa sometimes, wondering how she was managing the role she had been given. I did not blame her anymore, but I still felt the complexity of that situation. It reminded me how often workplace outcomes are not just about skill or effort, but about timing, perception, and internal decisions that are not always visible to those affected by them. One day, I received a message from her. It was unexpected. She said she wanted to thank me for everything I had taught her and that she still relied on many of the things I had shown her in her daily work. She also admitted that she had struggled with imposter syndrome after stepping into the role, especially knowing the circumstances under which she had received it. She said she often thought I would have handled it better. Reading that message brought a mix of emotions I did not immediately know how to process. There was no anger left in me, but there was still a quiet echo of everything that had happened. I replied honestly. I told her that she had earned her place in her own way and that none of what happened was her responsibility alone. I also told her that I had moved on and was building something new for myself. After sending that message, I felt a sense of closure I had not expected. Not because everything suddenly made sense, but because I had finally stopped carrying it as an open wound. In my new role, things continued to evolve. I was given more responsibility over time, but this time it came with clear acknowledgement. When I contributed, it was recorded. When I led, it was recognized. When I succeeded, it was linked back to my work without hesitation. It was not perfect, but it was honest, and that honesty made all the difference. I also began mentoring again, but with a different mindset. I no longer saw it as something that could replace my own advancement. Instead, I saw it as a separate responsibility that coexisted with my personal goals. I made sure that while I helped others grow, I also made my own growth visible and intentional. I learned how to balance generosity with self-preservation. One of the most important changes in me was internal. I stopped assuming that silence meant recognition. I stopped interpreting vague praise as confirmation of future opportunity. I stopped waiting for decisions to reveal themselves and started participating in the conversations that shaped them. There is a kind of strength that comes from disappointment, but only if you allow it to transform into awareness rather than bitterness. I had to go through confusion before I could reach clarity. I had to experience being overlooked before I understood how to advocate for myself properly. I had to lose something I believed was guaranteed before I learned that nothing in a professional environment is truly guaranteed unless it is communicated and confirmed. Now, when I look back at that version of myself, I do not see someone who was weak or naive. I see someone who was deeply committed, perhaps to trusting, but genuinely dedicated to growth and teamwork. I do not regret that part of myself. I only regret not learning sooner how to protect it. If I could speak to that version of me now, I would not tell him to work less or care less. I would tell him to speak more, to ask more, to confirm more, and to never assume that effort alone will always be enough to secure recognition. Because effort is important, but clarity is what turns effort into fair outcomes. And in the end, that is what I learned the hard way. After that point in my life, I started noticing how differently I moved through situations compared to before. Even outside of work, I had changed. I became more observant, more careful with assumptions, and more intentional with the commitments I made. It was not that I became less trusting of people in general, but I stopped giving automatic trust to systems, especially professional ones, without first understanding how they truly operated. There were moments when I would catch myself slipping back into old habits. For example, I would sometimes agree too quickly to help someone, then pause afterward and remind myself that I needed to evaluate my own workload first. It was almost like retraining my instincts. The version of me from before would have said yes immediately, thinking it was the right thing to do without considering long-term impact. The newer version of me learned to pause, to think, and to align decisions with both generosity and self-respect. One of the most surprising things that happened after I settled into my new role was how often people would come to me for advice about career growth. I think they could sense that I had been through something that shaped my perspective. I did not share my entire story with everyone, but I would sometimes explain parts of it when it felt appropriate. I would tell them about the importance of clarity, about the danger of relying too much on implied promises, and about the need to understand how decisions are actually made, not just how they are presented. Each time I spoke about it, I noticed that I was not speaking from pain anymore, but from understanding. That was an important shift for me. I was no longer reliving the experience emotionally. I was extracting lessons from it. That is when I realized I had truly started to move on. Still, there were quiet moments when I would think about the past more personally. Late at night sometimes, when everything was still, my mind would drift back to that meeting room, to the exact moment I heard the promotion decision. It was strange how memory works, because even though the experience had lost its emotional grip, it had not lost its detail. I could still picture the expressions, the tone of voice, the feeling of silence afterward. But instead of pain, what I felt now was distance. It felt like watching someone else's story. Someone who worked hard, believed deeply, and was surprised by outcomes that did not match expectations. I no longer judged that person. I understood him. Over time, I also began to redefine what success meant for me. Before, success was tightly connected to titles, promotions, and recognition from authority figures. I believed that climbing the hierarchy was the clearest sign of progress. But after everything I went through, I started to see success differently. It became more about alignment, stability, and control over my own direction rather than external validation. In my current position, I found something I had not fully experienced before: consistency without uncertainty. I knew what was expected of me, and I knew what I could expect in return. That balance gave me a kind of peace that I did not realize I was missing in my previous role, even when I was working harder than ever. There was also a moment that marked another internal shift for me. During a performance review, my manager specifically highlighted how my leadership style had evolved. They said I had a strong ability to develop others while also maintaining accountability for my own work. Hearing that, I realized I had managed to rebuild the part of myself that had been shaken before, but in a healthier, more grounded way. After the review, I remember walking outside and just standing for a few minutes, letting that feedback settle in. It was not dramatic, it was not overwhelming, but it felt steady. And that steadiness meant more to me than any exaggerated praise ever had. I also started to reconnect with parts of my life outside of work that I had neglected during my most intense years at the previous company. I spent more time with family, re-engaged with hobbies, and allowed myself to rest without guilt. That was something I had struggled with before, because I used to associate rest with falling behind. Now I understood that rest was part of sustainability, not opposition to productivity. Even though I had moved forward, I never completely forgot the lesson from my past experience. It stayed with me in a quiet way, like a background awareness that influenced my decisions but no longer controlled my emotions. I became more careful about how I interpreted vague statements, more confident in asking direct questions, and more aware of how important it is to document agreements rather than assume them. If there is one thing I understand now more clearly than ever, it is that growth often comes disguised as disappointment. At the time, I saw what happened to me as a setback, something unfair and confusing. But in hindsight, it became one of the most defining experiences of my professional life. It forced me to see things I would have otherwise ignored, to develop boundaries I did not have before, and to build a version of myself that is more aware, more balanced, and more resilient. I do not think I would be the same person today if that promotion had gone the way I expected. I might have stayed comfortable, trusting the same patterns, never questioning how decisions are made behind the scenes. Instead, I was pushed into a reality that required me to grow in ways I did not choose at the time, but eventually came to value. And now, when I think about everything that happened, I no longer ask why it happened to me. I ask what it changed in me. Because that is the question that actually matters in the end.